So I'll make a quick start to this session on firms of the CSAE conference 2020-22. Thank you all for attending and to the presenters for coming. The format of this session is as other sessions, a four presentation slot where presenters will each have 15 minutes to present. And during this time, those in the audience can write questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and then they will be asked, if they want to ask those questions live after the end of all the presentations, where we will have about 30 minutes to have Q&A. So please write your questions in the Q&A box. This session is being recorded. So if you are called to ask your question live, then you will be recorded. If you are uncomfortable with that, then just please write it in the Q&A and I'm happy to read out the question for you. That's all in terms of housekeeping. Very much looking forward to the presentation. So I think that's it from my end. Smit, I'm gonna unshare my screen and let you get started.
Can you see my screen? Okay, hi. So yeah, so this is a kind of a project that we are doing at Good Business Lab with kind of our set of principal investigator researchers. So Arch Advaryu and Anand Naisdam both at University of Michigan and Teresa at University of Hawaii. And this is kind of like second trial in like 3 set of trials that we're doing on the kind of topic of worker voice. So just to give a brief overview, I'll keep this short to kind of the results that if in a large apparel export house in India, we introduced a facility for workers to kind of use mobile-based technology to enable direct anonymous communication with the employer. And this is an individual level randomized trial across 2 factories. And essentially the people who are in our treatment group, they get training on how to use this tool as well as reminder SMS. Just to give some summary of results, there's a low utilization. Only 5% of treated workers ever reported using it. But we do find like a 10% reduction in attrition at like significant at 10% level. And we do find like reduction in absenteeism of workers at like 5% reduction in absenteeism at 5%. We do suggest like one of the mechanism we think is driving is just an option value of voice. It's essentially arguing that just knowing that there is something they can use if there is need allows these results to pass through. Just to give some motivation, a lot of literature has stemmed from Hirschman's seminal work on exit voice and loyalty, and a lot of work has kind of till like 80s was focusing on union as a collective voice, as well as then there are like recent quasi-experimental work which look through like voice shock through employment relationships such as pay cut, mass layoffs, or hiring replacement workers. So a lot of these would use quasi-experimental method, natural experiment. But there is also now kind of prospective trials that are happening. So I said this is the second set of trials we're doing. First was where we did employee satisfaction survey with workers after a kind of a pay hike in India to kind of see how this voice through surveys elicits this response. There are 2 recent ones with Kai and Wang kind of look at workers giving feedback of their managers and their managers' bonuses being dependent on it. And Laura Bordu's paper on kind of like similar setting in Bangladesh, which works at like enforcing labor regulation. So there is like new work, this is coming, which is experimental, and our works kind of fit in this setting. Our work is very policy relevant as such because in garment supply chains where we are working, working conditions of the workers are always under scrutiny, and the firms which are operating, there is a growing pressure to incorporate better voice mechanisms. There are three major tools that are used, which is grievance redressal mechanisms, satisfaction surveys, and worker committees. And this is very important for firms which are especially involved in exports and essentially global supply chain. Is any uh, kind of negative incidents can lead to like loss of business for firms due to either sanctions from their brands which are buying for them, or through like losing orders through PR. So just coming for setting and the intervention. So this is done in two garment factories in largest apparel contract manufacturer in like National Capital Region, Delhi region in India. Kind of the kind of intervention is a worker voice tool from a company called Labor Solutions. So it is an anonymous two-way communication tool. So the way it works is a worker sends an SMS to a phone number dedicated for each factory. And then that message gets, the phone number gets masked, and then message appears on a dashboard for the HR person. So there is a central administration there who kind of looks at what the message is coming and then assigns this case to relevant HR executive, right? So for example, if the cases is related to say payments, the central administrator would look at the case, then like tag it as HR related case or salary related case, and then assign it to the person in the factory who is looking after HR. And the two-way feature comes in where they, if they need more information, they can ask for more information to SMS. So we want to keep anonymity because of like to kind of build trust as well as prevent the fear of retribution. But for example, some cases the identity is required. So if the case is my salary isn't isn't processed or is incorrect, then the HR representative needs to know the detail to actually get the case done. So in this case, they can ask for more detail. So just to give a brief outline, so these are some of the cases that are happening, right? So majorly cases are like message like people when the training happened, like hi, hello, good morning messages, which are predominant. But also there are kind of important messages such as sexual harassment, leave related, as well as like a provident fund or some of the like documentation not being correct. There's also cases of like collective voice through channel where we saw a case where the factory temperature where like people seem to be like together like sending messages in groups. So that kind of channel is also what we see is there. So I'll come to the timeline, but we see that there's a peak in the beginning of the project where I think some of the piled up complaint as well as some of the people testing out immediately after training that's coming up. There is a dip in, like there's a technological issue with the vendor. So you see dip in February, but things start picking up. This project was supposed to last for 6 years, last slightly longer due to kind of compensating for delays. But that's where essentially the project duration was. So just to come to study design, so we do an individual level randomization of workers in the two factories. We stratify the workers across production line and department level. And across two factories, around 7,550 workers are there. We divide almost half of them into treatment and control workers. So for obvious ethical reasons, we didn't do like prevent control workers from accessing the tool. So anybody can send the message. So there was a facility to just allow verified users to do it, but we chose not to do. And so the way we did was just the treatment workers were giving training session on how to use the tool, or as well as we to show the anonymity of tool, we do show them a live demo. Somebody sends an SMS during the training session and show how that would appear on the dashboard. We also send reminders to the workers to kind of just, for example, around 10 SMSs per sent. Some of them were like either wishing them festival and then telling them that this service exists. Some of them were like nudges to say, hey, 100 workers have filed a complaint, just solved them, please use this tool. And control workers are not getting this training or SMSs, but they are also not prevented from using it. We subsampled the workers from treatment and control group for surveys. So around 2,600 workers were kind of sampled for primary surveys. So just to give a brief timeline, so we did, this was done in 2018. So we did a baseline survey from in August to October 2018. Then there was a period of like the tool was introduced to HR staff to train them on how to use the system. And then from November, which we call the start of intervention, where we start like worker training. So tool becomes live for workers, and then through batches we do. So this is happening in a live factory environment. So we can't kind of get everyone out of the factory, train everyone simultaneously. So every day during close to their lunch hours, we get few people from the few production lines, do their training. So this happen in batches across the two factories. So this kind of ends with our like beginning of the end line survey and end of May. And our end line survey kind of somewhat kind of overlaps with some of the last period days of our intervention. So just to give a data collection, data that we have. So we, in the baseline survey, we collect data on demographic, mental health, satisfaction across along with the factories, as well as if they have any grievance or reported to their managers. And also because the phone access to phone is important and used as a phone, we also ask to them about whether they have phones, if they know how to send SMS, right? In endline, we do baseline measures, but also do survey on tool information, use, and trust. We have access to administrative data from the firm. So we get demographic data, but we get daily attendance data, hourly productivity data, and salary and promotion data of the people. We also have information on call records, like the messages that we received on tools. Unfortunately, we can't match them to individuals perfectly. So we have from administrative data and survey outcomes, phone numbers of people, but people keep changing their phone numbers. And for people who don't have survey data, their phone numbers are many times not correct. So we are able to match around 60 to 65% of cases to individuals. So just to show the balance table, the treatment and control group are balanced across the cases. And so this is also for survey sample. So this is essentially for the baseline survey sample. We do see at some attrition, but this is essentially showing for baseline survey too. So just to get to our empirical strategy, it is essentially looking at multiple outcomes that I'll come to do and run an ANCOA specifications for almost all the outcomes. Just for some of the outcomes, which, for example, productivity, where we have large panel data and large number of kind of outcomes across time. We use different depth with essentially clustering standard areas at individual level. All things have essentially strata fixed effects and time fixed effects we add for the variables which are panels. And we use essentially just for attrition, like that's the only different specification that we use. Just coming to the main result. So first thing we want to show is, because this is an encouragement design, we want to kind of see if there are enough spillovers, this, like, if everybody knows and information travels, then it's essentially very difficult for us to kind of say whether it worked, right? So what we find is, like, there is around like 45% in control group knew about the tool. So they knew whether they knew about the tool in terms of from the survey outcomes. But we do see around 83% of control group people mentioning that they are aware of the tool. So we do see at first stage, there's a differential knowledge of our tool. But I think the one of the most important thing to look at, say, column 3 is use of the tool. Because for someone to use the tool, they have to know that tool exists, but need to know majorly the phone number and how to send this tool. And I think that was a major driver. Even if people were aware, that didn't translate to control group being using the tool, right? So for the treatment group, around like almost like 7 to 8%, like people who are able to match cases are coming from the control group, but around 90-92% cases are coming through the treatment group. This data, like this is the data from survey, but also this data exactly similar pattern holds when we look at the administrative data from the Voce tool, right? And we do see like trust. We do have questions in endline about trust in the tool. We do see some high level trust in the tool, but we don't see like people switching between the tools or like less use of other tools. So for workers, usually for grievance redressal, they have the facility to either most predominant way they use grievance redressal or any issue they have, they will go to their reporting manager and or HR and just tell the complaint. And that's the major form. The other form is they have something called as complaint box where they can put in complaint, but that's essentially anonymous box, but there's no two-way. Like if you put in complaint, there's no record keeping or anything that can essentially keep accountability of who complained. So we do see like
just a couple of minutes left,
yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah. So this is a Kaplan-Meier plot of like attrition, and if you see, we see a kind of divergent line between control and treatment, which is like essentially we see lower lower attrition in the treatment group. This is same in kind of in regression format where we see around 10% reduction in things. The coefficient are in hazard ratio, not regression coefficient. And this is just show we see impact of like essentially like 0.46 percentage point reduction in attrition that corresponds to around 5% reduction in attrition. And we don't see any impact on productivity and no impact of salary promotion. Unfortunately, we don't see any impact on any of the like survey measures, essentially well-being or mental health of workers, even like perceived responsiveness. It could be a measurement error due to survey, or basically we are doing like most of this measure where we're seeing impact are kind of panel data sets where compared to this. So just to coming to last slide, we do, because this is a live firm, we do a like return on investment calculation for firm where we use cost to the firm in terms of subscription for the service, training cost for worker, as well as essentially time that we take workers out of the production line to see like convert through their salaries or like their profit generated per hour for the firm to convert it to training costs, and also like essentially how much firm paid for reminder SMS. That comes to around $16,000, and we essentially convert the absenteeism and attrition benefit into for treatment workers, essentially in monetary terms. So looking at firms per hour profit, like firm workers, as well as hiring costs for firms, and we see a positive return on investment for firm from this calculation. I mean, and we can discuss it later. This effect size is very similar to our kind of other study that we ran. And also like, even if only 5% workers mention using it, we see like larger impact across the treatment. I think I'll stop it.
Thank you for this super interesting presentation. We'll move on to Lukas. In the meantime, Lukas, you can share your slides, and participants can write questions in the Q&A box on Zoom if they have them. So feel free to do that. Lukas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giulio, and also thank you for the very interesting presentation already, Smit. I'm sure we'll have a good discussion later about this. I'm today going to present on formalized employee search and labor demand. This is joint work with Tsegai Tekle-Selassie at the Policy Studies Institute in Ethiopia and Mark Witte at ISA. Our paper is very much motivated by the observation that informality is a key characteristic of many markets in low and middle income countries. That goes from informality of firms to insurance and finance markets, for example. One specific dimension of informality that we focus on is the informality of firms' employee search. Such informality is prevalent in many developing countries, and what we mean by it is basically firms not posting vacancies publicly, so not putting out job adverts, but rather relying on personal connections or connections of existing employees to find new employees. I'll briefly show you the figure. This is just the percentage of workers that have heard of the current job from social contacts. So it's like worker level evidence, not firm level evidence, which doesn't exist to our knowledge here. But that already shows you that it's a relatively large percentage, and in Ethiopia and other like more lower and middle income countries, it's a really high share of workers who find their jobs this way. And conversely then for managers that look for jobs this way as well. In our context in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, we also find that in our sample, and I'll tell you later how we recruit our sample, 80% of firm managers tell us that they use network search mostly to find to look for workers. Some like a certain percentage uses like employment agencies of some kinds some of the time, but very few, like less than 10%, ever post actual vacancies that are publicly available or publicly advertised. So this is kind of the motivating fact that we, for our study, we wanted to ask the question, what are the implications of such informal network-based employee search? Is this optimal from the firm side? Like, do firms optimize given the market structure, or are firms misinformed about the potential benefits of formal employee search? And if we nudge them to take this up, does it change their behavior and potentially the like our outcomes as well down the line? Theoretically, the presence of network-based hiring can be a double-edged sword. It can be individually optimal for firms because search cost is lower. They can potentially screen better and have more information. It might also reduce moral hazard. Those are here like Rebecca Heath's paper and Christian Dustman et al. The first was a theoretical paper, so that's relatively well studied. But it can, like from a theoretical point of view, but there's also the possibility that the presence of network-based hiring can reduce the like firm growth, like economic growth or firm size, if there are certain frictions in the firm and you can't like fully discriminate with wages. So if you have to like can't set wages at the individual level, but rather have to kind of pay workers relatively similar wages. It's this theoretical paper here. So what we do is we try to test kind of which of the two frameworks prevail in our context in Addis Ababa. So what specifically do we do? We have a randomized controlled trial with 625 firms between 5 and 50 employees. that are interested in a vacancy posting subsidy. We recruit these through door-to-door recruitment in like active business areas in Addis Ababa. And we chose like the firm size A for them to be actively hiring. And B, we only included firms that were in principle interested in using a vacancy subsidy to make sure that like take-up would be sufficiently high. And then we have randomly assigned firms to 3 different treatment groups. The first one is a control group that doesn't get any support in posting the vacancies. The second one is our vacancy subsidy group. In this group, we offer all firms to bear all the costs for their advertising their vacancies, both on online job boards and offline job boards, on like social media channels, and in the main weekly newspaper in Addis Ababa. So we like bear all the monetary cost, and if the firms want to, we also bear the hassle cost of going there, dropping off the vacancies, and even designing them if they want us to. In the second treatment group, on top of the vacancy subsidy, we also add an applicant screening where we offer firms to pre-screen all the applicants on skills of their choosing. So we give them a list of 10 skills, and we then provide information about the applicants on these 10 skills. The idea behind the second treatment group is that one of the main reasons that firms use network-based hiring techniques is that they lack information about applicants that apply without any personal connection. They don't know if they're trustworthy, what kind of skills they have, and so on. And hence, we thought that like reducing these frictions might improve firms' willingness to take this on. For our main analysis, I'll already tell you now, we'll pool these 2 treatment groups because we don't see like significant differences as we had specified in our peer analysis plan, but I'll also show you some separate results. This treatment was, firms received the treatment for 4 months between April and October 2019. So we had a staggered rollout. And then we also have a post-treatment follow-up after the end of the treatment period to observe if we like permanently change their hiring behavior or like persistently change their hiring behavior after the end of the intervention. So otherwise, we do both an in-person baseline survey, then some follow-up phone surveys in between to avoid recall errors on hiring, because especially on like vacancies that are unfilled, we are worried that firms managers might not remember that if we ask a few months after they attempted to fill a position and then didn't quite manage. And then we have an in-person end-line survey as well at the end of the treatment period. We are generally, let me just briefly go through this. Our sample is balanced across the 3 treatment groups. They do not jointly predict the treatment. There are 1 or 2 imbalances, but nothing that kind of that's unexpected. Our attrition is really low. There were only 4 out of the 625 firms that we didn't reach for the endline survey after 4 months. So like we were not too worried about attrition here. And yeah, empirically, we have a very simple specification, just an all as with our pool treatment dummy. This is our main specification. We run everything with controls as well. We pre-specified both specifications, and the results don't change at all. So what I'm going to show you here is the one without controls, but the other one is in the paper and doesn't really change. So this brings me to the results, to our first result. What do we find? First, we look at take-up. Here, formal search is our first outcome. We've defined formal search as posting a job advert on any of the means that I mentioned earlier. So online, in a newspaper, or on official job boards. And you can see that in the control group, only 5% percentage points of, or 5% of the control group use any formal search. And then we increased this by 17 percentage points. So like almost by more than 300%. That's the extensive margin. Looking at the intensive margin, we go from on average 0.14 formally posted vacancies to 0.46 formally posted vacancies. So you can see it's like not all firms post vacancies. So this is like a reflection of that, as well as, and that's in column 3. In total, even now in the treatment group, the firms generally only take up our offer for about 38% of the vacancies. So they're somewhat selective as to which vacancies they post formally and which ones they don't. In terms of what do firms do in terms of actual hiring behavior? First, we look at vacancy creation. So does this lead to firms attempting to hire more, to fill more positions and to hire additional workers? We find no significant impact here on either the extensive or intensive margin. You can see here the coefficients in the first row, then the standard errors, and then Q values to correct it for multiple hypothesis testing below. In total, we find that like around 50% of firms attempted to, in our control group, attempted any hire during our treatment period, which was lower than we had hoped, but we had an attempted coup, like political coup during our treatment period and severe electricity shortages and so on. So we got a bit unlucky with the general environment. But yeah, so we find no impact, no average impact on vacancy creation. And then if we look at hires, we find marginal significant impact before multiple hypothesis correction of any that on the likelihood that firms conducted any hire. And then in column 5, if we look at the percentage of vacancies filled, we actually find a pretty large reduction in the likelihood of them filling vacancies. So if you compare to the control group mean, in the control group, 88% of firms of vacancies posted by firms. So here you can see the smaller sample size. So we had to restrict this to for firms who have posted any vacancy. In the control group, 88% of vacancies were filled on average. And then that's minus 20 percentage points in the treatment group. So there's a substantial decrease in the fraction of vacancies filled. This is obviously not what we had expected originally. And so we kind of thought what could drive this effect, and why would firms struggle to hire off these formal search channels? Because by posting formally, we don't rule out that firms also rely on the network search at the same time. So that's something that I'll come to not on the next slide, but in the one after. For now, I just want to briefly show you that our screening treatment on any of these outcomes doesn't really make any difference on any of these outcomes, neither on take up, nor on vacancy creation, nor on the hiring outcomes. So the screening addition didn't have any additional effect, and we interpret this to mean that information frictions about work seekers don't seem to play a major role in firms' hiring decisions here.
A couple of minutes, Lukas.
Yeah, that's fine. So coming back to this, why firms weren't able to fill the vacancies. Well, what we find here, we split our vacancies up into white collar vacancies and non-white collar vacancies, where white collar vacancies is basically office work and managerial work. So higher level work, if you want higher complexity work, generally requires high levels of education and so on. And we find that our treatment increased the likelihood of posting any white collar vacancy, the number of white collar vacancies, and the fraction of white collar vacancies posted among treated firms. So it's somewhat significant before multiple hypothesis creation. Afterwards, it's just at the edge of 0.1. So it's at least like reasonable evidence, I think, for potential effect in that direction. If we look at the effect size as well, especially on the extensive margin, you can see it's almost a doubling, not quite, but close to a doubling of the fraction of firms that post any white collar vacancy. So we think that firms basically posted more ambitious vacancies, which they then struggled to fill. That's also when we look at the number of hires. Now this is vacancy posting. If you look at the number of hires, we don't see a corresponding increase in white collar hires. Indeed, we even for non-white collar hires, we even see a marginal decrease, but that's mostly driven by a substitution away from posting non-white collar vacancies to posting white collar vacancies. So firms seem to like use this opportunity to post different vacancies and to target a different pool of work seekers. These effects of like the lack of hiring effects here are not driven by a lack of applicant numbers. We have an increase in applicant numbers, but rather it might be that that firms just didn't find the applicants that they needed. And indeed, and I'll summarize these results when we look after the treatment period about managers' beliefs, we find that they update negatively about the usefulness of formal search channels, which is not too surprising. They update negatively both about the quantity and quality of applicants that they can obtain through formal search channels. The effect on formal employee search don't persist. So like afterwards, they go back to just hiring through social networks. But we find that there's persistent decline in overall hiring after the treatment period, which might suggest that managers, like we have some suggestive evidence that managers actually work harder to retain existing employees. I'll just give you the summaries and not go in detail here for the sake of brevity. Yeah, and come to the summary right now and to the discussion. So our first kind of takeaway is formal employee search doesn't stick. Firms even update negatively about the usefulness of formal search methods. So it's unlikely that there's some kind of information frictions preventing firms from taking this up. It doesn't seem like they underestimate the benefits of it, and that's why they don't do it. We observe a persistent shift. So to some extent, the shift towards white collar vacancies persists in the post-treatment results. But we only observe the shift towards white collar vacancies in the vacancy posting and not in hiring. And we observe an overall decrease in hiring levels after the end of the treatment. So what's our contribution? And that's going to be my last slide here, I think. We think one of the main contributions that we can make is to show that barriers in the hiring process can affect the composition and not just the quantity of firms' labor demand. The papers that I'm citing here, they're all focused on the quantity of labor demand, kind of how many workers get hired. We show that at least in terms of vacancy posting, like the search channel can also affect what types of vacancies are posted. We also speak to a relatively large literature that shows positive effect of interventions that enable applicants to signal their skill to firms on their labor market outcomes. But there's no real research, I think, so far showing on whether, like on the firm side, actually these this also affects like firms' hiring outcomes if they have received better information about the whole set of applicants. And finally, we show that firms learn about formal employee search channels and adjust their labor demand beyond the treatment period, suggesting that firms have incomplete information about the labor market conditions and that they kind of still have scope to learn, if not about the absolute usefulness of the of these formal employee search channels, but rather potentially about the composition of the applicant pool and whether they actually have a shot at hiring white-collar workers overall by using these channels. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments later on.
Thank you, Lukas. We'll move swiftly to the next presentation by Assi. So if you can unshare your screen, and Assi, if you could share your slides. And if there are any questions from the audience, please put them in the Q&A. Thank you. The floor is yours, Assi.
Okay, I forgot to unmute my mic. Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me very well? Okay, all right. Good afternoon, dear participants. In this paper with my co-author Linge Mbai and Maximiliano Tani, we look at the relationship between labor mobility and innovation in Africa. Sorry. You know, when we think about innovation, most of the time we think about investing in R&D, we think about multinational corporation, sending labs, or sometimes in international trade where one buys simply a new product from the rest of the world. And very few times we think about labor mobility, you know, as a channel for the diffusion of knowledge. Yet, we think that this is an important and even a cheap way by which knowledge not only transfers across borders, but also generates new knowledge. And in this slide, what I do, I present the result of a survey of about 2,000 people that Maximiliano, so one of the authors, interviewed at the airport. And when they were traveling for a short period of time, they were asked what would have happened if they did not go. And in 4 cases out of 10, people were saying that if they did not go, they would have no idea of what would go, you know, what would happen in terms of the industry. They would not be able to either train or bring some knowledge and understanding to the people they were going to meet. And in some cases, they say that by just observing the customer, you know, or the supplier, they were able to develop new products. And as example, some people were saying that by not communicating or being near one another, they will not be able to transfer this knowledge. So the idea from this is that knowledge moves when people move. And that's the main idea of this paper, where we investigate to what extent short-term mobility of people can be a mechanism for knowledge transfer and innovation by focusing on Africa. And when I say we focus on Africa, we specifically compare Africa with the rest of the world. And we think this is extremely important in terms of policy for Africa, in the context of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and also in terms of this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, where movement of people has become very limited. And regarding the literature, one challenge is how do we measure that knowledge? You know, it is very difficult to measure something like how much knowledge you have. And what the literature has done is to focus on advanced economies, because this is where we have better data, even though the data are highly imperfect. And so most of the time, the literature focus on measures of total factor productivity as an outcome to which relate the flows of people going around for a short period of time. And the literature finds a positive relationship between these two. Others look at patents as a clear output of innovation, and they still find this positive effect of temporary labor movement. But as you know, patents, are just the tip of the iceberg of what innovation really is. And in the case of Africa, not all innovation necessarily result in patenting. So the literature today tells us that the effect of a better mobility, of higher mobility, is positive on innovation. And this is similar to the effect of an increase in the stock of skilled labor. So on the basis of that, we tried to frame how to gain some insight from the data on innovation that exists. So we adapt a model that we borrow from Gray and Al 2020. And the basic idea is that if you have a shock, to labor, which is here, the left-hand side, firms react by either changing the unit requirement of that labor, of changing the output. And we adopt the same framework here to say that if we have a shock in the supply of labor, which in this case is a shock to the supply of skilled labor as a result of mobility. So how would a firm adjust? And firm can adjust in three possible ways. First, they change the technology they use in the production of the items, and they use the technology that is using intensively the factor that becomes more available. In this case would be a skilled labor, sorry. So an increase in the supply of skilled labor can incentivize firms to adopt a technology that makes a better use of skilled labor and change the process through which firms produce the items. And this is innovation in process. A second possible way, a firm can simply change the output of the item that it produces. For example, by having more units, or more output per unit of labor. And that is the second element of the equation. So this will be innovation in product or services. Or a third and last possibility, the firm can respond by simply changing prices of the input factor that occur. So if there is an increase in the supply of skilled labor as a result of more movement of people, the relative price of skilled labor should be lower, and that should, incentivize firms to use more of it. And we use this to try to draw some insight. And this is simply an exercise of reverse engineering, where we can relate mobility on either the probability of innovating in product or innovating in process. And the difference between these two underpins different responses on the side of firms that receive a particular shock. So that is the theoretical framework we use to interpret the empirical results that are presented in the next slide. And here we go with the empirical part. The empirical analysis is based on a sample of over 83,000 firms from the World Bank Enterprise Survey and from over 100 of countries, among which 31 African countries. And basically, we have two innovation variables. The first variable is innovation in product or services, and we call it one. If a firm answers yes to the question, have you introduced new or significantly improved product or services over the last 3 years? That means that they have innovated in product, and we call it zero otherwise. And on a similar basis, we construct the variable innovation in process. And we also construct an aggregate measure of innovation, combining both innovation in product and innovation in process. Let me say that we consider this measure of innovation based on firm survey as better reflecting adoption of technology in the context of Africa as compared to other measures such as R&D or patent, as discussed previously. And to measure short-term labor mobility, we rely on tourist arrivals data from the WDI. The data measure the flows of international visitors in the country for a period not exceeding 12 months. And the data are referred to as tourism, but actually they capture trips for various purposes, including not only leisure and holidays, but also trips for businesses and training purposes or for professional visits. And in a section of the paper, we focus exclusively on business visit using data from the UN World Trade Organization. And the control variables consist of firm level and country level determinant of innovation. And now the methodology, we use the following linear model where INNOV IJT represent one of the measures of innovation previously discussed for firm I in country J at time T. And TAJT is our short-term mobility variable for country J at time T. And the coefficient on the interaction between the Africa domain and short-term mobility allows us to determine if there is a difference between Africa and the rest of the world regarding the effect of mobility on innovation. We first estimate the equation using OLS, then to address potential endogeneity issues, we rely on the control function approach by Wooldrit 2015. And for the control function approach, we need an instrument for our short-term mobility variable. And the instrument that we use is derived from the trade and migration literature. Basically, we estimate a gravity model of short-term mobility on its exogenous dyadic determinant. These are, let's say, variables that are unlikely to directly affect innovation. So you have, for example, whether the origin and destination country share a common language or a common border, the distance between the origin and destination countries, and so on. And we estimate the model using Poisson-Seydoux maximum likelihood. I do not show the result, but we find that the model predicts very well bilateral short-term mobility. And in a second step, we generate predicted short-term mobility from the gravity model, and we aggregate over country and year to obtain an exogenous source of variation in short-term mobility, and we use it as instrument for actual short-term mobility. So let's move to the estimation result. First, the OLS estimations. We find, based on the OLS estimation, that short-term mobility is positively related to innovation, whatever the type of innovation we consider. So this is the first line on the table. And when we compare Africa with the rest of the world, as you can see in column 4, short-term mobility result in higher aggregate innovation in Africa compared to the rest of the world. And when we disaggregate by type of innovation, we find that this is actually driven by innovation in product, as you can see with the positive and significant coefficient on the interaction term in column 5, as opposed to column 6 when it comes to innovation in process. And we check the validity of the OLS estimate with the control function approach. And let us focus here on the interaction term. As you can see, the OLS estimate are confirmed here in terms of sign and significance for aggregate innovation and innovation in product. And the difference here is with innovation in process, where the coefficient on the interaction term becomes non-significant. And based on this result, we say that the probability of innovation, as a result of short-term mobility is higher in Africa vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And this is strongest in the case of innovation in product and services rather than innovation in process. And in what follows, we perform a series of—
a couple of minutes left. Sorry to interrupt you, Assi.
Okay, thank you. That's okay. So we zoom in each African region and we compare with other regions using Europe as reference group. And the results show that on average, African regions are less innovating than the EU. And this is given by the negative coefficient on the African regional Burmese. However, short-term mobility is associated with more innovation in each of the African regions as short-term mobility increases compared to the EU. And this is given by the positive coefficient on the interaction terms. And it's like a region, let's say advanced economy are at the frontier of innovation. So a push, we say that a push to labor mobility would result in higher innovation capacity in Africa because Africa still has larger room for maneuver than developed regions. And we also investigate heterogeneity based on R&D intensity, but let's skip this part. And we also use an alternative measure of short-term mobility by focusing exclusively on business visit. And we find stronger evidence on higher probability of African firms to innovate relative to the rest of the world as short-term mobility increases. And in conclusion, let me not sum up the key findings. Let me just say that this study suggests that by promoting free cross-border movement of people, African countries can increase the innovation capacity. And so government and policymakers should make the continent, a more attractive place to visit by all means, including promoting social political stability, improving business environment, developing network in key areas such as education, and also easing administrative travel requirements. Okay, let me stop here and thank you for your attention.
We can, if I can be made host in case our tech support needs to go, we can keep the room open for around 15 minutes if people want to continue the discussion. I don't see other questions from the participants in the Q&A, but if people are happy to stay, they can write one now and maybe we can keep chatting for another 15 minutes or so. Otherwise, the session is formally closed. And so everyone is free to continue attending other sessions later in the day. Yeah, exactly. Hopefully there is Gather Town available for folks to interact later on. It's actually open throughout the conference, but I think there is a specified slot where there should be a critical mass of people attending.